History remembers him as the Merry Monarch, but his death was anything but merry. A body once adored now steamed faintly in the cold light of February. Blood still pooled beneath the stiffening neck. Skin not yet waxen, but already failing, flaking around the lips, distended at the gut. The scent of lavender oil could not mask the stink of feces and scorched cloth. And the hands, the same hands that once raised goblets and stroked courtesans, now twitched faintly with the last gasps of post-mortem defiance. Physicians whispered prayers with mouths tight as tourniquets. The blade gleamed. The body was warm. For Charles II, the man once toasted from court to gutter, as the Merry Monarch death came neither swiftly nor clean. His final days were not a tale of serenity, but a grotesque unraveling of blood bile and betrayal. The king who had restored the throne did not ascend to the heavens in grace. He sank into something darker, wetter, and far more human. If you crave chilling, untold corners of history, like this video, and subscribe for more. The room was not a death chamber, at least not in name. It was the royal bedchamber at Whitehall, lined in thick velvet crimson and gold damp at the seams. 14 doctors had been summoned. 14 men in wigs and silk holding knives, clamps, and potions older than the kingdom itself. The king had seized for hours, his body arching violently like a marionette in mid-break. They had burned his feet to rouse him. They had opened his veins in all 4 limbs. They had poured boiling spirits between his lips. And now, as his breath ceased, they did not mourn. They opened. The official story would speak of science, of noble curiosity. That the king's heart failed him after years of joyful living. That a brave autopsy was performed in service of medicine. That Charles II, ever generous, had given his body to knowledge. But the silence of those present, broken only by the sound of scalpel on cartilage, told another story. There was something they had to find, or something they had to erase. The first cut was below the ribcage, deep, confident, familiar. The royal surgeon Sir Edmund King had dissected dozens of bodies, but none had worn a crown. None had once laughed so loudly that Parliament paused in envy. None had shared a bed with actresses and dukes alike. Yet here he was, splayed open like a criminal thief in a teaching hall. Steam rose. The blood was dark and sluggish. The liver was swollen. The lungs bruised and wet. The heart, some whispered, wasn't where it should have been. Moved, rotated, enlarged. No one would say. The reports, when they came, would speak of apoplexy and internal strain. But the men in that room remembered something else, the way the king's body had twitched after the first incision. He wasn't entirely dead, or, if dead, not yet empty. And in that pause, between flesh and finality, lingered something primal. The weight of monarchy peeled back like skin from bone. What had once been sacrosanct was now meat. The divine right of kings reduced to wet anatomy. The courtiers wept in another room. But the physicians knew this body had secrets. The bedchamber had been cleared of favorites. Barbara Palmer, once Duchess of Cleveland and once royal mistress, had not been summoned. Nor had Nell Gwynn, the orange seller turned enchantress of Whitehall. His illegitimate children had been called, but too late. Only James, the Duke of York, now heir, was allowed to linger, and even he kept his distance a shadow on the far wall. He did not speak. He did not weep. He simply watched his brother carved like a feast. Later they would say the dissection was rushed, that the doctors feared rot or infection. But Charles had died only minutes before. The sheets were still hot beneath his back. His crown, unworn for years but still present, sat atop a nearby cushion untouched. No one dared move it. There had always been 2 Charleses, the mask and the man. The one who danced through masquerades, and the one who woke coughing blood into his pillow. The one who charmed Parliament into surrendering powers, and the one who paid spies to poison dissent. In life, he had mastered contradiction. In death, the contradictions bled out. The king had once laughed at death. Literally. He had joked of it, played with it, invited it to his bed. When a man attempted to shoot him in the park, he chuckled. When plagues returned to London, he held mask balls with garlic stitched into his sleeves. He called syphilis God's little penance and referred to bloodletting as a good vintage release. But in the end, death was not amused. For days before the end, his body had betrayed him. First tremors, then blindness in one eye, then humiliation, he lost the ability to urinate. Servants heard him screaming behind the chamber doors. His royal physician wrote cryptically, "The bladder is uncooperative. The king's humility increases." Still he smiled for visitors, laughed when handed a wig, called himself an old goat with a broken fiddle. But the truth was visible in the linens, the smell, the tremble of his once steady hand as he tried to lift a goblet and failed. The king was dying from within, and he knew. In the final hour, as his heart stuttered and failed, they said he reached out not for God, but for his brother. "Let not poor Nellie starve," were his final words, referencing his mistress, Nell Gwyn. A sentence of strange tenderness, of guilt, of love, of distraction, and no one knows. But it was not scripture. It was not glory. It was not, in the end, Mary. The blade touched the sternum. The king did not flinch, but the room did. They had scented the rooms with ambergris and crushed violet, hoping to mask the sour stench rising from the bedclothes. Courtiers insisted he merely had a fever of exhaustion, yet the chambermaids changed his sheets thrice daily, each time discovering a fresh stain, not of wine, but of slow bodily collapse. Charles II had always understood the theater of power. He wore it like cologne, his smile warm and wolfish, his walk languid, deliberately unbothered. His court was a spectacle of laughter lace and endless masquerades, all meant to drown out the rot beneath the floorboards. But rot has a way of rising first as odor, then as omen. His teeth had long since betrayed him. They blackened one by one until even his silversmith grew uncomfortable crafting false molars to replace what had fallen out. He could no longer chew meat without bleeding. His tongue, once nimble with wit, now tasted metal. Still he smiled. Always smiled. They called him the Merry Monarch because he seemed to live untouched by consequence. During the years of Cromwell's Grey Republic, his name had been whispered, like heresy. Charles the Boy King, in exile, a royal phoenix waiting to reclaim the fire. And when he returned in 1660, the city exploded in drunken relief. Bells rang, virgins danced, soldiers wept, but merriment is a mask, and Charles wore his beautifully. In the taverns of London, songs praised his return. Here comes the king with wine on his lips and a mistress on each arm. But inside Whitehall, the perfume only grew thicker. Candles scented with musk halls washed in rosewater servants instructed to douse every room in cloves. For something was wrong, deeply biologically wrong. Physicians noted intermittent fevers, fainting spells, small purple lesions on his chest. At least 2 suspected kidney disease. Another muttered about mercurial wasting, a veiled reference to syphilis which no one dared name in relation to the king. But there were other whispers, too. Barbara Palmer had seen him scream in his sleep. She said he dreamed of fire, of black horses, of bloodied hands reaching from the river. He would wake soaked in sweat, calling for his brother, or sometimes for his father Charles I, who lost both his crown and his head. The king's inner circle played their roles. They laughed at his jokes, repeated his dirty anecdotes. They pretended not to see when he fumbled a goblet or winced from hidden cramps. Even his mistresses were briefed, "Don't touch the lower back. Avoid pressure on the left hip." It became choreography, this dance of denial. But bodies do not lie. And Charles's body was a crumbling cathedral. Inside him, organs began failing in concert. His stomach bloated unpredictably. His urine turned dark as pitch, sometimes red. He would sweat profusely, then shiver as if touched by ghosts. Court tailors widened his robes monthly to accommodate the swelling. He refused to wear black, fearing it made him look like a corpse. But in the candlelight, his skin often looked gray. The court physicians, trapped in layers of obedience and fear, did what all fearful men do. They hid behind rituals. They bled him when he fainted. They administered purgatives when he retched. They leached poison from his blood using medieval contraptions so brutal that servants gagged at the smell. Still, Charles laughed. He mocked the physicians, calling them butchers with wigs. But even in jest, there was desperation. He knew they were helpless. He just couldn't afford to say it. Meanwhile, James, his younger brother, watched. He always watched. From behind velvet drapes, from shadowed thresholds. James had been raised in exile, fed on bitterness and sermons. He was a Catholic in a Protestant court, a wolf among sheep, and he saw the cracks in Charles long before the kingdom did. Rumors swirled. Would Charles name another heir? Would he convert to Catholicism on his deathbed? Was he being poisoned by Jesuits, by Dutch agents, by his own wife? Every affliction fed a new conspiracy. One night during a masque at court, Charles danced with 3 women in succession. He drank heavily. He spun in silk and gold. But behind a pillar, Sir Thomas Clifford watched him closely. The king's hand shook as he raised his goblet. His smile twitched with effort. And then, as the harpsichord played on, a thin stream of blood ran from his nostril. He wiped it discreetly. No one noticed, except Clifford. Later, in a private letter, Clifford would write, "His Majesty is cheerful as ever, but I believe it is the laughter of a man who hears his coffin being built in the walls." Charles had built a world of mirrors, each one reflecting joy, grandeur, indulgence. But somewhere beneath the velvet and gold, the mirrors cracked. What stared back at him was not a monarch, but a man slowly being hollowed out from within. There are records private scribbled in the margins of medical books of strange treatments applied to the king in these years. Mercury tinctures, electric eel shocks, pigeon carcasses placed on his feet to draw out death. Some even claimed he bathed in lamb's blood. Whether these were desperate remedies or desperate myths, no one knows. But it is certain that in his final years the king reeked not of rot, but of desperation disguised as elegance. In his chamber beneath the draperies soaked in clove and violet lay a man whose body was devouring itself day by day, inch by inch, but to the world he remained the Merry Monarch, and he smiled until his teeth fell out. It began as a whisper in the galleries, a snide remark behind a fan, the sort of comment that drips slowly through court invisible as poison in wine. He laughs too much. At first it seemed absurd. Charles II's laughter was his kingdom's salvation. After the cold, brutal rule of the Puritans, when music was banned, theater silenced, and dancing punished, his return felt like divine reversal. London erupted in joy, not because they loved monarchy, but because they were starving for sound. And Charles gave them a feast, trumpets, masquerades, poetry, and pleasure. But pleasure unchecked begins to curdle. His laughter, once infectious, began to seem rehearsed, his jests more cruel, his audiences more nervous, like a man who knows the crowd no longer laughs with him, but at him, and pretends not to notice. The throne had been won not by strength, but by seduction. Charles did not conquer his kingdom, he charmed it into surrender. And charm, like perfume, hides rot only for a time. The court became a stage, every corridor lined with actors. Dukes and barons primped like courtesans. Ambassadors competed in flattery. Mistresses were paraded as political assets. Royal bastards were legitimized like trading cards. Charles encouraged it all. The more extravagant the show, the less anyone noticed the seams coming loose. And so the kingdom became a theater of excess. Champagne soaked the gardens of Whitehall. Musicians composed overtures for the king's erections. Parliamentarians sent daughters to court, not for marriage, but for the chance at favor. Disease flowed from bed to bed. bearing names instead of symptoms: the French scratch, the Palatine pox, the bishop's gift. But beyond the walls of Whitehall, the laughter began to echo differently. The people of England, sated with spectacle, began to murmur. They noticed that taxes rose while banquets grew louder, that grain shipments dwindled while the king gifted entire manors to mistresses. That plague returned more often than promises were kept. The Great Fire of London had torn the heart out of the city, and still Charles danced, as if he were invincible. He wasn't. He caught smallpox once and nearly died, but the official report called it a fever of delight. His hair thinned and fell in patches, but periwigs were already fashionable. When his voice began to rasp, cracked from nightly excess, his courtiers said it made him sound more poetic. Truth was not forbidden at court. It simply had no audience. There was one man who dared speak plainly. Gilbert Burnet, a Scottish clergyman and scholar, once said in hushed confidence, "He never said a foolish thing, and never did a wise one." The line reached Charles himself. Instead of outrage, he chuckled and replied, "That's because my words are my own, but my actions are my ministers." He always had a reply. That was the danger. Charles could charm his way around accountability like a pickpocket with royal blood. But beneath the laughter was spit coated on handkerchiefs splattered in blood after coughing fits dribbling from corners of his mouth when he thought no one watched. Physicians noticed his breathing changed after the fire. They speculated off the record that he had inhaled too much ash and lime from the burned city. One noted wheezing in the early hours, followed by silence that alarms. Another wrote, "He does not sleep. He simply lies very still and grinds his teeth." At court dinners, servants carried away plates barely touched. The king had lost appetite. His belly swelled while his limbs thinned. Some blamed royal gout. Others muttered darker things: black bile, dropsy, slow poisoning. Charles called it old man's mischief, but privately, he chewed willow bark and clove to numb his back. And still, he performed. At one masque, he dressed as Neptune, god of the sea, trailed by courtiers dressed as naiads and mermaids. He could barely walk, but insisted on dancing. He sweat through his costume. His left leg gave out twice. His eyes were glassy, sunken, yet he smiled. Afterwards, he vomited blood behind the tapestry. No one ever mentioned it. This was how Charles ruled, by erasing reality with pleasure, with layers of music and flesh and wine so thick that no one dared look underneath. Every secret sin had its reward. Every whisper of rebellion could be bought off with a smile, a knighthood, or a mistress. But slowly, this web of indulgence began to tremble. The public, too, was changing. The plague years had returned. The city stank of corpses and coal. Bread lines lengthened. Catholic-Protestant tensions burned under the surface like wet coals. And in their hunger, the people began to look differently at Whitehall. The jokes about Charles's bastards turned bitter. The ballads became crueler. One scrawled verse found nailed to a tavern door read, "Our king is a jester, with poison in cup, his body a tomb, his crown just a prop." Charles had eyes everywhere. He read the verse. He laughed at it publicly. But privately, he ordered the tavern closed and the printer arrested. That winter, he took to walking alone through his private gallery, a long, narrow hallway, lined with portraits of his ancestors. Henry VIII glowered. Elizabeth stared with ageless disdain. His father, Charles III, the beheaded king, stood eternal in oils, gazing just to the left. Charles II once said he liked the gallery best because it was quiet. But a maid reported hearing him whisper to the portraits late at night, especially to the one missing its head. It was a Thursday, the 2nd of February, 1685. Cold clung to the drapes. The fire in Whitehall's royal bedchamber had died low, and the candles, perfumed with amber resin, guttered in their sconces. Charles had risen late after a sleepless night, muttering in French and coughing into his pillow. But the day was ordinary. No omens, no thunder, no black-cloaked stranger in the corridor. He smiled. He joked. He washed his face with rosewater and asked for a fresh shirt. And then he fell. Not a stumble, not a faint. A full collapse, as if the strings of his body had been cut all at once. One moment he stood near the hearth, warming his hands, recounting an off-color story about the Duchess of Portsmouth and a bishop's wig. The next he was on the floor, limb-splayed eyes rolling like coins dropped into a basin. His valet cried out. A physician was summoned. Then another. Then all of them. He did not speak for over an hour. His mouth worked as if chewing invisible bread. His left arm seized. His legs twitched in opposite directions. His bladder voided. The Merry Monarch had become a shivering, spasming shell. And for the first time in decades, Whitehall fell silent. When he finally opened his eyes, they were unfocused, fogged like a man drowning beneath ice. He whispered something fat, sortir la lumière, and closed them again. The doctors did what doctors had always done. In panic, they cut him open. Bloodletting. 6 ounces from the left arm, 12 from the right. He did not flinch. They placed hot irons at the base of his feet. No reaction. They forced his mouth open, poured spirits of lavender hartshorn, crushed pearls down his throat. He retched once, then stopped. For hours he remained somewhere between breath and stillness. No longer a monarch, barely a man, he was becoming a body. The room changed with him. Footsteps grew softer. Laughter disappeared. Every silk-cloaked noble who passed the door knew instinctively, the king is not recovering. The king is becoming something else. Outside, James weighted his hands behind his back, fingers twitching in sets of 3. He asked no questions. He gave no orders. But already his eyes were shifting, measuring the tapestries, counting the servants, noting which doors remained open and which did not. By nightfall, Charles roused again. But the damage had taken hold. His face drooped slightly on one side. His tongue seemed too large for his mouth. He called for his dog, Beau, a small spaniel, who had slept at the foot of his bed for years, but when they brought it, he recoiled. "That's not mine," he hissed, voice brittle and wet. "That's the one with the bite." There was no such dog. He became delirious, but not gently. He laughed in jags, then sobbed over a misplaced candle. He accused a doctor of hiding a sword. He mistook a footman for his father. He begged a crucifix not to blink. And all the while the physicians performed. The next day they blistered his scalp, applied pigeons still flapping to the soles of his feet, inserted a metal catheter to relieve the blockage of his bladder. Charles screamed not a word, but a wet guttural howl that echoed through the palace walls like a man being peeled. It was then that a young maid assigned to change the linens dropped the basin. She saw him naked, and wept. This was not a king. His belly was distended, bruised, purple and yellow. His legs were thin as saplings, his chest spotted with sores, his back marked with fresh cauterization burns curling like dead ferns. She dropped to her knees, whispering, "God forgive me," as if she had trespassed into a tomb before it closed. By Saturday, the courtiers no longer asked for updates. They spoke of succession in drawing rooms behind fans in the hush of drapery. Letters were dispatched across the channel. The Dutch ambassador left early. The Venetian envoy, always poetic, wrote home, "The sun here dips below the window, and even its shadow does not rise." Meanwhile, Charles faded. He drifted in and out of sense, sometimes lucid, asking about Parliament or requesting mulled wine, and sometimes trapped in some private theater of the damned. He spoke of birds in his stomach. He demanded they remove the fire beneath his skin. He called out to shadows no one saw, but it was the moment he asked for the mirror that broke them. A full-length glass, oak-framed and polished, was brought. He sat propped against a dozen pillows, skin-translucent lips cracked and bleeding. He looked for a long time, then said quite softly, I see him. He's behind me. No one moved. No one asked who he was. That night he confessed, not to a priest, not yet, but to his body servant, the one who had helped him hide his coughs, clean his vomit pin, his wigs. He asked the man to lean close, and with the intimacy of a dying secret, whispered, "Tell them I was not Mary. I was afraid. Always." It was the only thing he ever said that didn't make it into the records. By Sunday, his pupils no longer shrank to light. His tongue protruded dry as ash. He struggled to swallow water. Every exhale sounded like a rusted hinge. The doctors said he was improving. They had to. They had no idea what else to say. Charles did not die that day, but he ceased to live as king. What lay in that bed, twitching, leaking, weeping, was not royalty. It was the aftermath of a kingdom built on performance, now collapsed under the weight of its star actor. And soon, the curtain would fall. The bed was wide and carved with gold-gilded lions, fleur-de-lis, and the Stuart crown looping endlessly along the canopy. Velvet pillows stuffed with down and musk, drapes thicker than battle banners. But beneath the grandeur, the body of Charles II lay stripped of every illusion. The physicians had removed his robes, then his undergarments, then the modest cloth he'd clutched near his hips. It was all clinical, they said, for the good of treatment. But once the king was exposed, there was no turning back. He shivered beneath the open air like a criminal awaiting the lash. No ceremony, no crown, no robes. Only a naked man on a fouled mattress, his skin blistered, his lips blackening from dehydration. One of the physicians we do not know which began cauterizing his feet again, burning small crescents into the flesh to revive circulation. The room filled with the scent of cooked blood and aged silk. The king's breath hitched, but he did not scream. They inserted the catheter again, this time more roughly. There was tearing. Blood leaked around the metal shaft. He whimpered. His eyes rolled back. One servant new to the household ran from the room and vomited into a vase in the corridor. No one followed. It is said that power dies with dignity. But that is a lie crafted by those who've never seen it die up close. True power rots. It leaks. It resists. And in the end, it begs. Charles II did not die like a martyr. He died like a man being slowly erased inch by the very hands once paid to serve him. And still he spoke. He tried to give orders. He tried to flirt with the nurses. He tried to ask for soup. But his tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. His words emerged as slurs and groans. Once he called for the crown, and a valid misunderstanding brought the golden coronet from its velvet box. Charles looked at it, with what little clarity remained, and laughed, not with mirth, but with something dry and broken, like a door creaking open in a house that should have stayed shut. Then came the priests, two of them Anglican and Catholic, like rival surgeons over a shared corpse. The king's faith had always been a game of shadows. He was baptized Anglican, but many suspected his private allegiance lay with Rome. Now, at the edge of breath, it had to be decided. The soul was a prize to be claimed. The room was cleared of courtiers, curtains drawn, candles relit. Father Huddleston entered quietly. A Benedictine monk, a smuggled ghost from the past. Years before Charles had promised him sanctuary if ever England turned its wrath again upon Catholics. And now, with the last of his breath, Charles offered him something far more precious, his confession. The priest leaned close. Whispers passed, no record remains of what was said. Only that Charles received Catholic last rites in the darkness beneath velvet folds as blood crusted along his thighs. When the door reopened, no one said a word. But James knew. The next King of England, a Catholic by birth, had just received the most powerful inheritance possible, a secret deathbed conversion. Enough to shift the tides of legitimacy. Enough to turn England's stomach for decades. But for Charles, the ritual did little. He lingered, still twitching, still rotting. The physicians resumed their pageant of failure. They applied cupping glasses to his back, slicing the skin open and drawing blood into globes like crimson marbles. They lanced his swollen stomach and watched in horror as black fluid oozed out in streams, carrying a smell that turned even hardened men pale. They scraped the tongue. They opened the gums. They pressed leeches to his temples. His nose bled without touch. It was no longer medicine. It was a siege. And yet amid the ruin there were moments of chilling lucidity. Charles asked again for Nellie. Nell Gwyn, the mistress most loved by the common people. A woman who sold oranges in the street before she enchanted the crown. She was not summoned. She had been banished months before. But his thoughts clung to her like vines around a grave. He whispered, "Has she eaten?" They lied and said yes. He nodded. "Good. That's good." Then he drifted again. His fingers began tapping patterns on the sheets, the same rhythmic code he'd used with his brother during their childhood exile. James recognized it, but said nothing. The king was calling for escape. By Tuesday morning, his skin had turned the color of damp parchment, his eyes fully sunken. His gums bled with each breath. No one sat beside him now. The courtiers came only to peer. The bedchamber had become a sacred stage, the final act unfolding, a tragedy no playwright dared write. At noon, a servant accidentally dropped a porcelain basin. The sound shattered the stillness. Charles flinched. The physician closest to him leaned in and asked, "Your Majesty, are you in pain?" The king's eyes opened, slowly, deliberately. Then he said with a voice rasping like wind through a coffin slit, "Do not let them bury me in that damned damp vault at Westminster." It was the last full sentence he ever spoke. Later some would claim his final words were a joke, that he said, "I'm sorry, gentlemen, for being such a long time dying." But that line appears only in polished memoirs, only in texts printed after the dust had settled. Those who stood in the room remember something else. The smell, the sound of wet breathing, the sharp metal, the screams behind the curtains, the body twitching like a puppet on invisible string. That was the truth of kingship. Not the crown, not the coronation, but the long, humiliating striptease of mortality beneath gilded sheets, soaked in pus and regret. Charles II died at 11:45 a.m., February 6, 1685, or so the records say. But some claim his body twitched long after. The death itself was quiet. A final breath, half sigh, half growl, followed by the sound of something deep inside collapsing. His eyes remained open, glassed over, as if caught mid-thought. For nearly a full minute, no one moved. Even the physicians, those orchestrators of his long agony, stood still, not in reverence, but in calculation. The king was dead, and with his death came opportunity. Outside the bedchamber, servants wept. The bells of London began to toll. In Parliament, word spread like fire through dry thatch. The throne is empty. The mask has fallen. Prepare for James. Inside the chamber, the doctors began to strip the corpse. No time for mourning. No prayers. No holy water. They had been waiting, for the body, while still warm, held mysteries. It had suffered and twisted in ways no one could fully explain. Symptoms that contradicted. Blood that refused to clot. A mind that flickered in and out of madness with an intelligence too deliberate to be dismissed. So they brought out the tools. Scalpels, bone saws, hooks and forceps, the implements of knowledge, or violation, or both. The autopsy began within an hour of death. The king's body was laid upon a marble slab taken from a secondary chamber. The royal bed, soiled and sagging, was left behind, its sheets curled like molted skin. The slab was cold, but Charles was still warm, his flesh pliable, the blood sluggish but not dry. They began at the chest, a deep incision down the sternum, the skin parted like unbaked dough. Beneath it bruised, muscle-swollen, lymph-congested lungs. They noted fluid in the cavity blackness of the spleen and a remarkable softness in the liver. But one physician, Sir Edmund King, paused at the heart. Not properly seated, he muttered. The heart was larger than expected, discolored, the valve spongy. Some thought it had rotated. Others suspected an aneurysm. One whispered, "It does not look human." That comment was not recorded in the official account. Next, they opened the stomach. The smell forced two assistants from the room. Not the usual scent of decay, but something richer, stranger. A blend of bile-aged wine and something almost sweet. A mixture that did not make sense. Inside they found dark fluid and curdled residue, the remains of the dozens of remedies forced upon him in his final hours. Egg yolks, crushed pearls, laurel oil, possibly even powdered toad. They cut deeper. The bowels were distended, the kidneys pale and riddled with cysts, the bladder torn. A physician recorded walls thinned as if from prolonged boiling. No one could explain how a man who had walked days prior could contain this level of internal ruin. Then came the head. A difficult choice. Royals were rarely opened above the shoulders. The skull was sacred, but curiosity or something more prevailed. The scalp was pulled back. The cranium cracked open. The brain, slightly swollen pockets of liquid along the meninges gray matter, unusually veined. The surgeon paused. There was a spot, near the base, a darkened mass, hard and irregular, possibly an old hematoma, possibly something worse. Some believed it explained the hallucinations, the irrational laughter, the dreams of birds inside his belly. No one recorded its removal. After 3 hours, the autopsy ended. The body, now carved like a feast, was wiped clean with lavender cloth and rosewater. The organs were placed in jars ostensibly for study, though many would vanish within days. The heart, curiously, was kept in a sealed tin and handed to James. Its fate remains unknown. The official report was published by the College of Physicians. It spoke in cautious Latin. It cited apoplexy, overwork, and the natural exhaustion of a vigorous life. There was no mention of seizures, hallucinations, or dark spots on the brain. Nor was there any record of what the king had whispered just before his death. "Don't let them look too closely." Only one servant claimed to hear it. He repeated it once. Then, never again. In the days that followed, the body was embalmed, its cavities filled with resins and spices, the skin stitched and painted. A powdered wig replaced his hair, which had been partially burned off by the cauterization. Gloves were slipped over fingers that had blackened at the tips. A crown was placed beside the corpse, but never on the head. When they laid him in state behind heavy velvet curtains, they did not let the people near. Viewings were brief and from afar. The lights were kept low. Witnesses remarked that the face was strange tight at the mouth, the eyes too wide. Some believed it was not him. Others claimed to see him breathe. There is a letter now preserved in the Bodleian Library, written by an Italian ambassador who had viewed the king's remains. The body is cold, but the room was warm with rot. Something in me whispered, this was not death, but a secret preserved in flesh. I left that place certain of one thing: Charles did not leave us alone. In private, the surgeons burned their notes. Not all of them, but enough. One page survives, written in a shaking hand, signed only G. It reads, "The king was opened. What we found does not belong to medicine. Bury him quickly." And they did. But not before the knives had stolen everything sacred. Not before the monarch became matter. Not before the crown was removed, not in glory, but because it no longer fit his head. They began removing the portraits 2 weeks after the burial. No proclamation, no public decree, just quiet hands lifting gilt frames off centuries-old nails. The Grand Gallery of Whitehall, once a corridor of pride and lineage, became a hall of ghosts. The painted eyes of Charles II, there were many, no longer met visitors. They were crated, veiled in muslin, or simply gone. Some, the more flattering likenesses, were sent to minor estates. Others vanished in transport, lost to weather, or damaged in transit. But those who knew the palace whispered a different truth. They were destroyed, burned, slashed, painted over, not by his enemies, but by his heirs. James, now King James the Centre, walked the halls with a different silence. Where Charles had ruled with laughter, James ruled with gravity, distrust hanging on him like a second cloak. He did not want reminders, not of the smiles, not of the indulgences, not of the body carved open while still warm. What remained of Charles was paper, and even that paper began to change. Clerks revised records. Diaries once filled with anecdotes of royal wit were replaced with reports of erratic behavior. Some described his final days as delirious, others as cursed. The word apoplexy appeared in nearly every retelling, bland, sanitized, controllable. The man who died howling was now in print a victim of the gentle fatigue of sovereign labor. Even his likeness on coinage was altered. The soft jaw replaced by something firmer. The curls sharpened. His image on church walls, once used as a rallying point for restoration, loyalists, was quietly scraped away. It was not erasure born of malice. It was fear. Because in those final days, everyone had seen it, the unraveling of divine right into biological horror. The monarchy, for all its trappings, had become a leaking bag of meat. If Charles the Merry Monarch, the living symbol of England's joy, could die like that, what did that say of the throne itself? And so, they unremembered him. The court moved on. Balls resumed. The Chapel Royal reopened with new music, new sermons. But the air had changed. Laughter was quieter. Toasts shorter. The courtiers stepped lighter, spoke more formally. A generation raised on spectacle now flinched at the smell of perfume, fearing what it might cover. In the royal apartments, servants whispered of sounds at night. The creak of leather boots pacing the old gallery. A cough. A low chuckle echoing down corridors that had not yet been repainted. A page claimed to see a figure staring from the shadows, wearing no crown, only a white burial shirt stained at the chest. He was dismissed. Even the dog, the last of Charles's spaniels, refused to enter the gallery where his master once walked. He would stop at the threshold, growl and whine until carried past. James ordered the gallery sealed. Meanwhile, Charles's illegitimate children, of which there were many, faced their own quiet reckonings. Some were honored, some were forgotten. One, a girl of 10, was denied entry to the funeral, despite Charles having kissed her forehead only weeks before. Another, the Duke of Monmouth, who fancied himself a true heir, would soon lead a rebellion and lose his head for it. That was the legacy Charles left: uncertainty wrapped in charm, rot masked in laughter, no air of clear mind, no memory uncontested. But there were those who remembered the man as he truly was. Old physicians sworn to silence, servants who had wiped away blood, scrubbed the piss from marble, a maid who still wept when folding royal linens, remembering how he called her Rosebud through cracked lips. They kept their silence, not from loyalty, but from the weight of horror, because what they saw in that bed, what was done to the king, and what leaked from him, was not fit for song or scripture. One physician, long retired, was said to have kept a sketchbook. In it, a single drawing, a face contorted mid-seizure mouth, foaming eyes open. Above it, in trembling Latin, the words, "In vita regnavit, in morte liquefactus est." In life he ruled, in death he dissolved. No funeral oration said so much. The tomb, when it was finished, was plain. Charles II was buried in Westminster Abbey beside his father, the beheaded king he had once feared to become. But unlike Charles V, there were no public pilgrimages, no martyrdom. The vault was damp, just as he had dreaded. Mold bloomed on the stone. Visitors noted the smell. Within a generation, few could remember which slab was his, and yet the silence endured. Because kings do not haunt halls with their victories. They haunt them with what they become when the laughter ends. There are many ways to embalm a body. Spices, linen, resin packed into the cavities where lungs once breathed. But the more lasting embalming is done in memory, where the flesh rots away and leaves only myth. And so Charles II remains the Merry Monarch. Not the man flayed open on a marble slab, not the twitching figure who begged for breath between screams, not the corpse that steamed as they carved into it, but the mask, the myth, the echo. History, ever hungry, preferred it that way. It was easier to remember the laughter, the way he danced, whined, winked. Easier to recall the masks, the fireworks over the Thames, the kisses stolen from actresses. That king painted in oils, sung in ballads, toasted in alehouses was safe, manageable. But that king never died, because he never existed. The real Charles, the one whose bladder split, whose skin peeled, whose final whisper was fear, was buried not in Westminster, but in silence. A silence so thorough, it infected even the histories written decades later. Biographers with powdered wigs and royal pensions called his reign a golden restoration. They called his court vibrant. They called his death dignified. But how does one dignify the stink of burning feet and the whimpering of a monarch stripped naked before strangers? They don't. They lie. They gild the coffin and turn the twitch into a smile. They say he ruled with joy. They don't say his final words were a plea for escape. They call his laughter freedom. They do not say it was his only weapon against decay. That is how power survives itself, not through truth, but through the cold preservation of illusion. Even now, Charles II's name conjures pleasure, restoration, theater, wit, a man reborn from exile into celebration. But that rebirth came at a price no one wanted to examine, a soul gnawed by dread, a body unraveling long before the autopsy. And in that final hour, when his breath rattled and his spine arched in seizure, he became not a man, not a king, but a mirror. One that showed every lie the monarchy required to function, that kings are divine, that suffering can be dignified, that a crown keeps the body whole. It does not. What keeps power alive is repetition. Repetition of the tale, the image, the title. Every time a coin bears his face, the myth survives. Every time a history book says, Charles the Tolerant King, the scalpel is buried deeper, not in flesh this time, but in memory. And yet, beneath it all, the warm corpse lingers. The body opened before it cooled, the twitching hands, the whisper about the damp vault, the priest summoned in secret, the cauterized feet, the unburied truth. He told them, don't let them look too closely, but they did. And then they looked away. The Merry Monarch was dissected not only in body, but in legacy. The real man, the terrified one, the man who dreamed of birds in his belly, was erased by a narrative clean enough for children and kings alike. This is not new. History bleeds the inconvenient out of its pages. Anne Boleyn's severed head blinked too long, so they shortened the story. Richard III rotted under a car park, so they made him a hunchback villain. Mary, Queen of Scots, screamed at her execution, but we remember the dignity, not the spray of blood across the scaffold boards. And Charles, he died, being burned alive in fragments. But the record tells us he joked even then. He didn't. He asked to be buried somewhere dry. And we didn't listen. Because when kings die, we do not bury the truth. We embalm the lie.